During World War II, there were many American commanders who played an essential role in defeating the Axis forces, but a certain few were head and shoulders above the rest. Some of them are well known, earning fame for their actions. But there are others whose name is unknown, yet their contribution was crucial to the Allied victory. These are the 5 greatest American generals of World War II. 5. Omar Bradley. Omar Nelson Bradley was a senior officer of the United States Army during and after World War II, rising to the rank of General of the Army. Born in Randolph County, Missouri, he graduated from the West Point Military Academy in 1915 alongside Dwight D. Eisenhower as part of the class the stars fell on. Following the United States' entry into World War II, he oversaw the transformation of the 82nd Infantry Division into the 1st American Airborne Division. He received his first frontline command in Operation Torch, serving under General George S. Patton in North Africa. After Patton was reassigned, Bradley commanded the 2nd Corps in the Tunisian campaign and the Allied invasion of Sicily. In 1944, he commanded the 1st U.S. Army during the invasion of Normandy. In the wake of the breakout from Normandy, he took command of the 12th United States Army Group, which ultimately comprised 43 divisions and 1.3 million men, the largest body of American soldiers ever to serve under a single field commander. The units under his command captured the famous bridge at Remagen, which opened the way for the encirclement of 300,000 Germans in the Ruhr pocket, saving countless American lives and shortening the war by at least 2 months. Bradley was known as the GI General due to his concern for the common soldier. He frequently visited the front lines to observe conditions and talk to the troops directly, earning their respect and admiration. Bradley always advocated for improvements in living conditions, equipment, and training, ensuring that the needs of the troops were met. After the war, Bradley led the Veterans Administration and later became Chief of Staff of the United States Army and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Promoted to General of the Army in 1950, he played a crucial role in the Korean War, advocating for President Truman's containment policy and supporting the dismissal of General MacArthur in 1951. 4. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Nicknamed Ike, Eisenhower played a crucial role in planning Allied operations in Europe. Initially, he served as the Chief of Staff to General Douglas MacArthur, then as the Chief of Staff to General George Marshall, where he gained experience in strategic planning. In 1942, he was appointed the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. One of his first major operations was Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942. This campaign succeeded in pushing Axis forces out of Tunisia and Libya, paving the way for the Allied invasion of Europe. Following the success in North Africa, Eisenhower coordinated the Allied forces in the Italian campaign, starting with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Despite stiff German resistance and difficult terrain, the operation eventually led to the fall of Mussolini's regime and the surrender of Italy in 1943. Still, while Italy was considered the soft underbelly of Europe, the campaign proved very bloody and slow. This led to one of the most important and daring offensives of the war. Eisenhower's most significant role came as the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces for the D-Day invasion. On June 6, 1944, under his command, American, British, and Canadian forces launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, landing on the beaches of Normandy. This operation marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi control. Following the success of the Normandy landings, Eisenhower continued to lead Allied forces in the European front, coordinating operations such as Market Garden and the Battle of the Bulge that eventually led to the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945. His leadership and strategic vision were fundamental to the Allied victory in Europe, proving he was not only a brilliant commander, but also an expert in man management and logistics. After the war, Eisenhower served as the military governor of the U.S. occupation zone in Germany, and later as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. His success during World War II propelled him to the presidency of the United States, serving 2 terms from 1953 to 1961. 3. George S. Patton. Nicknamed Old Blood and Guts by his troops, George Patton was one of the most renowned and controversial American generals of World War II. He initially commanded the Western Task Force during the Allied invasion of French North Africa, where his leadership and aggressive tactics contributed to the success of the campaign, particularly during the Battle of El Guetar in March 1943. Subsequently, Patton led the 7th U.S. Army during the Allied invasion of Sicily. Despite initial setbacks, his forces quickly gained ground, capturing key objectives and forcing the Axis withdrawal from the island. However, his controversial actions, including slapping a soldier suffering from battle fatigue, led to his temporary removal from command. In Sicily, his competition with British General Bernard Montgomery started to take place, which would turn into a heated rivalry for the rest of the war. But Patton's most famous role came in 1944, during the Normandy invasion. Initially, Patton was placed in command of the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group as part of Operation Fortitude, a deception campaign to mislead the Germans about the location of the actual invasion. After D-Day, Patton commanded the 3rd U.S. Army, leading it through France and into Germany. His rapid advance across France increased his reputation as a bold and aggressive general. Patton's 3rd Army played a crucial role in relieving the besieged town of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. His quick response to the German offensive helped stabilize the Allied front and ultimately defeat the German counteroffensive. In early 1945, Patton's 3rd Army crossed the Rhine River, breaching Germany's last major natural defensive barrier. His forces then spearheaded the Allied advance into the heart of Germany. After the war, Patton served as military governor of Bavaria, where his administration was characterized by strict discipline and efforts to rebuild the region. However, he strongly disliked the Soviets. Patton said he was sure that the Germans were the only decent people in Europe, and went as far as saying, "We may have been fighting the wrong enemy all along." This led to tensions within the Allied leadership and his eventual removal from command on September 28, 1945. 2. George C. Marshall. Marshall was the Army's Chief of Staff from 1939 to 1945 and is best known as the Allies' true organizer of victory during World War II. Marshall's rise to the top in the U.S. Army followed paths opened by reforms of the early 20th century that emphasized professional military education, a new staff system to prepare for war, and closer coordination of the citizen soldiers of the National Guard with the regular Army. As a staff officer in World War I, Marshall was centrally involved in the planning of offensives by the American Expeditionary Force in France. Later, as assistant commander of the infantry school, he left a strong imprint on the tactics that the U.S. Army was to use in World War II. Extensive work with National Guard units gave him exposure to the civilian world and experience in dealing with politicians, which was unusual for officers of his time. Though Marshall had never commanded a division, he became Chief of Staff on the 1st of September 1939. At that time, the U.S. Army lacked modern weaponry and was roughly the size of the Dutch Army, which survived less than a week against the German Blitzkrieg in 1940. By the time the U.S. Army began fighting the Wehrmacht in 1942, its effective combat strength had increased more than tenfold, and Marshall was the architect of this remarkable buildup. There is no exaggeration in saying he was one of the most important American generals of the war. Marshall keenly appreciated that success in a multi-theater coalition war required harmonious civil-military, inter-service, and inter-allied relationships. He won the confidence of President Franklin Roosevelt, worked effectively with his naval counterpart, Admiral Ernest King, and ensured coordination of American and British military leadership through the combined chiefs of staff, providing unity of command in combat theaters. After World War II, Marshall continued to serve in various roles. As Secretary of State from 1947 to 1949, Marshall advocated rebuilding Europe, creating a program that became known as the Marshall Plan, and which led to him being awarded the 1953 Nobel Peace Prize. This plan ultimately helped rebuild war-torn regions, remove trade barriers, modernize industry, and improve European welfare after a long and brutal conflict. 1. Brehon B. Sommervell. Brehon Sommervell was a general in the United States Army and commanding general of the Army Service Forces in World War II. As such, he was responsible for the U.S. Army's logistics during the war, the paramount task during a conflict. A World War I veteran, Sommervell became head of the construction division of the Quartermaster Corps in December 1940. As this was a period of rapid expansion for the U.S. Army, his immediate concern was the construction of a series of camps to house the large numbers of draftees who were then entering the Army. He was also responsible for constructing new facilities to hold stores and munitions. By December 1941, 375 projects had been completed and 320 were still underway, with a total value of $1.8 billion. The best known of these projects was the Pentagon, an enormous office complex to house the War Department's 40,000-person staff together in one building. From 1942 to 1945, Sommervell commanded the Army Service Forces. He was responsible for the U.S. Army's logistics, ensuring the supply and administration of the Army within the United States and the support of troops overseas. As America's chief wartime logistician, he demanded ample supplies for the troops, at the right place and at the right time. He understood well the decisive role of superior material and mobility and the military gains which could be achieved through this. Also, the U.S. Army, which bore most of the burden for this endeavor in Western Europe and the Pacific, had to adopt a new method of arms procurement in which complex equipment had to be bought or manufactured quickly and efficiently. This approach also had profound implications on the logistical and managerial elements of the war. In conclusion, Sommervell's organizational skills and leadership proved invaluable in this role and approach, this being the reason why we consider him the greatest American general of World War II. The contribution of every other general and soldier should not be downplayed. War is a multi-dimensional and complex event, and every single man in the military has to play his part to make the whole system work properly. Yet, these are the American generals, which we considered to be the greatest during the largest military conflict in history, the Second World War.